Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session of the webinar on nitrogen. We've seen very good lectures, discussions this morning, and I'm sure that the afternoon session will be as inspiring and insightful as the morning session has been. So we will start with Dr. Rooney Ingalls, who was trained as a chemical engineer in Norway, in Trondheim. And after that, he worked for quite some years at Yara on the production of green ammonia, not only in Norway, but in many places, in fact. And I noticed also sometime in the Netherlands. But in 2010, he left Yara and started working for the company N2 Applied that he co-founded himself. And it is a company that is developing plasma-based nitrogen fertilizer technology that sounds very interesting and that I'm sure we will hear all about in the next 20 minutes or so. So Rooney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for allowing me to give you this little talk about the technology that I think is a good alternative also to Haber-Bosc. Do you see the screen? No?
Yeah, but not yet in the presentation mode.
Not yet in the present. No, that's right. I need to open it in a different way. I did the same mistake earlier today.
Yeah, this is looking good. Yeah,
this is looking better.
Yeah, this is perfect.
Okay, it's about nitrogen use efficiency versus the Haber-Bosc process itself. It's not changing. It's a little slow here. Yeah, we have touched upon the green shift, the paradigm shift, and as we all register, lack of gas and expensive gas gives high cost fertilizer, and the remedy to that is renewable energy and cheaper electricity and alternatives to the expensive gas. We have been through this. Haber-Bosc is very much related to the population growth, no doubt about it, but also questioned, is the ammonia too cheap? Are we overusing it and overdosing it? And from my history in Yara, I remember this was a big issue. And we didn't really like that the anthropogenic nitrogen almost approached the biological one. So what's so fantastic about the Haber-Bosc process? The Haber-Bosc is actually just the synthesis that you see to the left here, the HB. Before that, there is a steam reforming process, and if somebody wanted to greenwash the Haber-Bosc process based on gas, they could say that we have prepared this process already for producing blue ammonia. And this plant can produce 70% of its ammonia can be considered blue because seven molecules of CO2 per 16 molecules of ammonia is concentrated and can be sequestered. But we're back to the nitrogen efficiency, which is probably the main reason why everybody is pointing at the Haber-Bosc for the time being. We are overusing, and I made a mass balance of nitrogen over the Scandinavian food chain, including Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And we're starting with 150 kilotons of nitrogen fertilizer as an input into the food production in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It has a low nitrogen use efficiency. It gives 250 kilotons of vegetable protein, which we use 100 kilotons for food and 150 kilotons for feed in Scandinavia. In addition, we are importing soya proteins, and this totally gives 150 kilotons of nitrogen as food on the table, and 450 kilotons of nitrogen in the slurry urine from the livestock. And from these 450 kilotons of nitrogen, we calculated carefully 100 kilotons is being lost. And when the farmer is spreading the remaining 350 kilotons nitrogen on the field, the yield and efficiency of that nitrogen is not good enough to produce as much as he had originally. So he needs to buy more fertilizer. In addition, this cycle is having a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that we are also focusing on. The main culprit, normally criticized, is the ammonia process and the fertilizer process, but it's not so bad. It's only 2 million tons of CO2 equivalents from the production of the fertilizer that we are using in Scandinavia. There is a lot more from the field, and there is a lot more from the cow, the methane, and from the slurry coming from the cow and the pigs. There is also methane and nitrous oxides. What is N2Apply doing? Yeah, we are taking the slurry. If you take basically a cow slurry, a pig slurry is ammonium bicarbonate. The pH is around 8, maybe 8.5. So the ammonia is there as a baking powder. What we are doing is we are taking solar power and air, and we are producing nitrates. And these nitrates, sorry, they're not showing on the graph here. They are absorbed in the slurry, and the slurry coming out after the treatment contains not ammonium bicarbonate, but ammonium nitrate. And the CO2 is being stripped off together with the air. So if we go back to the situation in Scandinavia, this is the situation at the average farm. And if we install our unit here, we stop the losses. We stop the losses in the storage, and we stop the losses in the spreading by adding 300 tons of nitrate nitrogen. And that gives in total 750 tons of nitrogen to the field, which gives a much higher yield than we originally had, and more than enough to feed the animals from the same field, but also giving an additional protein yield from the extra nitrogen that is being spread, so we can reduce the imported feed. So this illustrates that the inefficiency of the livestock farming is and the loss of nitrogen from the livestock farming is partly compensated by importing nitrogen fixated soya protein from South America, but also at the expense of rainforest. This is how the new greenhouse gas emission situation looks, and yeah, you can see that we have reduced the total greenhouse gas emissions load in this process by about 30%. And still, we have not done anything about what comes out of the stomach of the cow. That is for later. The history of the Haber-Bosc process is old, and it's an enormous technology of development, and it's an enormous investment. And if you look at, take my career from 1980 to today, there are trillions of dollars being invested in ammonia capacity, 2.5% extra capacity every year. This is a smoothened curve. I didn't, for simplification. And I've also considered the nitrogen demand population curve to be more or less the same. And as you see, after 250, I expect that the effect of eating less red meat, drinking less milk, adopting a better diet, and the natural development of the population could curve like this. It's more a challenge when the curve is going down than if it continues to grow. It's scary when it grows, but the industry need to see that it might drop anyway. So what our ambition is that on this demand population curve, we will start to take shares of this with the technology that we can offer, the technologies that others can offer, direct nitrogen fixation, etc., etc. But I have related it here to our technology. And we think that we can probably take about 40% of the demand or the need by recycling nitrogen, capturing nitrogen, white nitrogen, direct nitrogen fixation, etc. I think these technologies will develop. There will still be a room for blue or green ammonia, and I think urea is going to be the difficult part there, because urea is a huge nitrogen fertilizer for Asia and rice production, and it carries the CO2 along with it. So some of the old capacity of urea will probably still be there. What is blue ammonia? Blue ammonia is already developed, existing. Topsoe is able to make it. It's slightly more expensive, but it's a lot more risky to do these kind of investments because you don't know the development. And in order to cater for the risk, the profit of building these plants have to be improved. And if we go back to the ammonia process that I said could be greenwashed, it's also very important that the existing ammonia industry is basically operating at break even, not covering the capital cost in most years, except for some every 6th year when there is room for doing new investments. And this is the situation also for the blue ammonia. To make these investments, you have to be very sure that you have access to cheap gas and you have access to a market that is able to and willing to pay. And fertilizer ammonia is not probably the best payer for blue ammonia. Green ammonia is probably more likely to be an ammonia for the fertilizer industry. It requires electricity, and it can be scaled up from relatively small scale, like our scale that is typically suited for a farm of 200 cows. So what are we doing on the plant? Let's on the farm. If you refer everything to one cow, then a well-producing, not top, but well-producing European cow is producing 90 kilos of nitrogen per year in its urine and slurry. And already after 24 hours, 10 of these kilos are lost basically as ammonia, directly from the urine decomposition with the enzyme urease. Then in the storage, another 20 kilo nitrogen is lost as ammonia. If it's stored cold and properly, it will be less. In the higher, warmer climates like Southern Europe, it's a little more. And then after this storage, a lot of fermentation has taken place, whether anaerobic or aerobic, and there is more free ammonia. And when you spread it in the field, we're losing also another 20 kilo nitrogen as ammonia. So our business case started initially by looking at the losses in the field. We said, if we treat the slurry, acidify it with nitrates and nitrites, we can stop the ammonia. And even if we use quite a lot of energy to produce the nitrates, the net consumption of energy per kilo nitrogen is not killing the project. But we also have seen that we want to go also closer to the cow, because the quality of the slurry, if you treat it early, is probably better. It will contain more organic material. It will be less fermented. But we have also seen that yes, we are stopping the ammonia loss, but in total, through the processing and 6 months of storage, there is a nitrogen loss. Just recently, we found through our own analysis that the third-party analysis were probably wrong because they found more organic nitrogen after storage. After the treatment and storage, they found more organic nitrogen, and we think that is not 100% correct. But it means that we are very close to coming up with a perfect concept, and that is we need to treat the urine, we need to treat the slurry as soon as possible. Few hours after it has left the animal, the better. And now we can see that we're still calculating that we have a loss of nitrogen, and we also see that we can reduce this loss quite considerably, because this is a maximum chemical loss from the loss of nitrites. So in the end, everybody is asking, what is your energy consumption on your process compared to the Haber-Bosc? And then you don't compare apples with apples. You compare apples with something totally different. But if you take a well-to-wheel principle and say that you require 6.9 kilowatt hours per kilo nitrogen to fix nitrogen, we can take the upper line here, which is the green ammonia, and then electrolysis is 58% efficiency. The Haber-Bosc process and the huge air separation unit is drawing another 15 kilowatt hours. Producing the nitrogen fertilizer with the 90% efficiency, a lot of the energy is coming from the ammonia plant. And then in the field, the 90% efficiency, getting it transported, stored for 6 months, and then transported again and spread in the field. There is another energy consumption connected to it. So a total energy consumption when it comes to the soil, it's about 19 kilowatt hours per kilo nitrogen. We do the same on the site. We have stopped some losses. We have made a balance in the storage, and we come to 15. So all in all, about the same energy consumption on the full well-to-wheel analysis. But we have still not really succeeded in reducing the electricity consumption in our plasma process. We are still at the level as Christian Birkeland was with the first industrial process in Norway. We are about at thermal equilibrium, but all scientists says it can be improved. This is what BASF did at the same time as Birkeland, and there were 2 technologies operating in Norway, one with the heat recovery and one with a very stable, you could say, glow discharge plasma that we showed in the previous picture. So we are studying the thermal equilibrium, and we are seeing that yes, it is at the best 51 kilowatt hours per kilo nitrogen. We calculated 70 in the business case, but we also see that if we can utilize the non-equilibrium situation by proper quenching, by activation of the oxygen earlier, we can lower the energy consumption, and we will be able to compete even better with the Haber-Bosc process today. This is where we are doing our development, and with the business case as we see today, we see that in Kenya, for instance, the business case is good because the cost of fertilizer is high now, and their ability to utilize organic waste and slurry from the animals is 0. So we really make a big difference in these areas where people are not used to utilizing the organic waste and the livestock slurry. So yeah, I will say thank you here and open for progress in the program or questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Rune, for a very interesting talk about this alternative for Haber-Bosc to come to fertilizers. There were already some questions, but I would like to move the questions to the discussion later on, where Rune will also be attending. And I would like to proceed with Professor Wouter Maas, who will give the second presentation. He is a professor at Ghent University in Belgium on I would say a very special assignment, sort of. He focuses his research on sensing technology using unmanned aerial vehicles, which we also know as drones. And he does that, for example, for agriculture or precision agriculture purposes, I should say. And I think that is what we will hear all about. So Wouter, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Floris. I will first start with sharing my screen. Hope that works. Is that okay? Can you see the shared screen presentation mode?
This looks perfect.
Okay, thank you. So indeed, I have a position at Ghent University on particularly drone remote sensing, and we do apply this for precision agriculture. So the talk for today will be about how can precision agriculture help to meet the fertilization reduction targets. Now, this has been discussed earlier today to great extent. So to grow our crops, we do need nitrogen input. This comes from manure and to a larger extent from fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. So, and with this in the nitrogen cycle, there's also a lot of pollution that's coming from groundwater, surface water, and also air pollution. And this has large consequences. So this has been sort of introduced this morning, a lot of consequences on air quality, ecosystems, greenhouse balances, soil quality, water quality. And because of that, we are actually exceeding the planetary boundary for nitrogen. So there's clearly a nitrogen issue. And if we look at fertilizer use, as also mentioned today, to a large extent, in the 20th century, we were successful in increasing our yields from agriculture with a 3- or 4-fold, whereas actually our agricultural areas only increased by 130%. At the same time, our yield increase was made possible due to a huge extent thanks to fertilizers, but they have increased by about factor 50-fold. So a much larger increase. So you can see immediately that there's a problem with the efficiency then of our nitrogen fertilizer. If we're looking at in Europe in particular, we see that the main source of fertilizers, of course, nitrogen. And this has peaked in the early 90s. Then, of course, there were regulations, but ever since, our nitrogen fertilizer use is still sort of leveling. So we should decrease this. And this is why also the European Commission agrees with that we should reduce our nutrient losses by 2030 by at least 50% and actually reduce the fertilizer use by at least 20%. And these are quite ambitious targets that were put forward. So in this talk, we'll just see, okay, how can precision agriculture help? And this might be some low-hanging fruit that's out there. Because of course, in conventional farming, most of the fertilizer is applied homogeneously to the field. So the entire field is given one level of fertilizer. And we also, this has been discussed in detail as well, we also know that this is notoriously inefficient. By 35 to 75% of the applied nitrogen is actually not taken up by the plants. So one of the reasons for that is that the requirement within the field is not the same. This was a potato field, I think about 9 hectares size. So a long field, this is an RGB image. This would be a an image that's closely related to the chlorophyll, and we'll discuss closely also related to the nitrogen content. And you can see large differences within a field that looks quite homogeneously apart from that. So we see that there's areas with very high nitrogen content in the plant, and there's also areas with very low nitrogen content. So if you would treat a whole field with the same dosage of fertilizer, of course, for some areas this would be overload, and for some areas it might not be enough. So the idea of precision agriculture is to improve this and to do it in application at the right time, at the right intensity, and at the right place, at the right location within the fields. So to do this, we first need to go to a three-step approach. And the first step is always to assess the spatial information. Okay. This can be done, for instance, with remote sensing. You'll get some map like this. And the next step then is to take a management decision, okay, to translate this into a task map that the farmer can use for applying fertilization. And of course, the final step is to actually apply this at a variable rate within the field. So these three steps are quintessential in precision agriculture. I will mainly focus on assessing the spatial information, but I will also touch upon these other two topics. So spatial information, how can we acquire this? Well, from historical knowledge, basically the yields. But this historical knowledge is often crop specific, and there's quite some differences between the years because of weather conditions. So this is not the most reliable source. A second possibility is to work with soil sensors, particularly measuring before the growing season. But whereas soil sensors are very useful, for instance, for estimating or for adjusting the planting density, they actually are not useful during the season because they don't give data on actually the crop status. So therefore, remote sensing methods actually work better. So if we just look at our remote sensing methods, we know that nitrogen in the plant, 5% of the plant consists of nitrogen, which is very high level compared to the other nutrients, but actually only a very small fraction of that is chlorophyll. So 1.7% of all nitrogen in plants is chlorophyll. Only 19% is about 19% is in the light harvesting complex. But still, traditionally, we've always been focusing our efforts on chlorophyll estimation. And this is because the total amount of nitrogen is often very closely related to the canopy chlorophyll content. So basically, we're targeting the canopy chlorophyll content, and we use that as a proxy for the above ground nitrogen on area basis. And why chlorophyll? Because this is a pigment, and a pigment that is absorbing light. So we can see how much light is being absorbed, and we can use that then to estimate the amount of chlorophyll present in a plant. So for instance, here, if we would go on the left here, you see the absorption by the different pigments in the plant. If you would particularly see, if you, for instance, would see in the blue region, you see that there's quite some pigments absorbing light here, chlorophyll A and B, but also anthocyanins and carotenoids. As a consequence, you have very low reflectance because there's a lot of light being absorbed. In the green light, there's no chlorophyll absorption, but there the absorption is taking place by anthocyanins and carotenoids, but to a lesser extent. So you have a higher reflectance in the green. And in the red, this is where it becomes interesting. In the red, the carotenoids and anthocyanins don't play a role. The only absorption in the red is actually by the chlorophyll. So we have a low level of reflectance if we have a lot of chlorophyll here in the red region. So the red region is very well suited for targeting chlorophyll absorption. In addition to that, we see that the near-infrared region, which is the longer wavelengths, which are less harmful for plants, there's no absorption at all. In fact, plants will be reflecting the near-infrared to a maximal extent. So what you can see is here that in the near-infrared region, you have very high reflectance, and there's also a sudden transition between the red and the near-infrared here, and this is called the red edge at about 700 nanometers. So in the past, most approaches were particularly targeting this red and the near-infrared reflectance, because you can see in a healthy canopy with a lot of chlorophyll, you would have a low absorbance, a low reflectance in the red and a very high reflectance in the near-infrared. And in an unhealthy canopy, I think healthy and unhealthy should be swapped here. so the green is healthy and the red is unhealthy. So in an unhealthy canopy, this distance would be less reduced. So traditionally, we were using the most traditionally used index to look at canopy health is the normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, and is actually just looking at the red and the near infrared wavelengths. And this NDVI or NDVI related indices were also the ones that have been used mostly for chlorophyll content estimation in agriculture. However, if you look at canopy reflectance, good crop growth actually has two different effects. You have an increase in biomass, which is translated also in leaf area, and which we measure with the leaf area index, the amount of leaves per area. And on the other hand, there's high chlorophyll concentration or high nitrogen content. So we want to actually target the high chlorophyll concentration. For fertilizer application, we don't want to look at where the biomass is highest. We want to know where the chlorophyll concentration is lower, so we can actually give some extra fertilization to these leaves. So we want to distinguish between high or low biomass and high or low chlorophyll content. So how can we do this? Well, this would be the canopy reflectance if the chlorophyll content remains the same, but only the leaf area would change. This is a modeling from a radiative transfer model. What you can see is typically if the leaf area would increase, you first would have canopy closure. So you have a strong decrease in the visual and an increase in the near infrared. And this will go even further if you have several layers of leaves. So whereas if you would keep the leaf area constant, but only change the chlorophyll, you would have again a reduction in the visual spectrum. So this is very similar to what we were seeing with the leaf area. So just looking at the red will not be a good solution, because then you can't distinguish leaf area versus chlorophyll content. What you do see here is that there's no effect of chlorophyll content on the near infrared, but that actually there is an effect in the red edge. This is this sudden transition, and actually it shifts from a lower to a higher chlorophyll content. It shifts towards the right. So this shift in red edge gives us a more specific information of the actual canopy chlorophyll content, rather than looking at the red or the near infrared spectrum as such. And though there's also some indices that we can relate them, such as the NDRE, the Normalized Difference Red Edge Index, that we can specifically use to target nitrogen content. And this actually helps, because this is in yellow, this NDRE, and you can see it is a little bit sensitive still to increasing leaf area index, but it is quite and it's quite more sensitive to increases in chlorophyll AB content. Whereas if you look at the traditional NDVI, NDVI is actually quite insensitive to specifically chlorophyll content. So NDRE is a better measure. So this was about the remote sensing. What are the platforms we can use for estimating our chlorophyll content? So first of all, the platform is the tractor-based. We put sensors on tractor booms. These are always active sensors, or mostly active sensors, which means they are always applicable even at night. So they emit some radiation, and they then measure the reflected radiation with the sensor. So the active sensors. The nice thing about it is that they're fully integrated. They give information in real time. This could be coupled then with an empirical model to the variable rate application system. So it does everything at the same time. There is non-imaging, so the detail that you get is less than from other things, but particularly the soil can be a disturbance factor. And these systems are quite expensive, 14,000 to 20,000 euro. So the few examples, the first systems only were sensitive in red and near infrared, but nowadays there are also systems which are also sensitive in the red edge bands, and there are even systems which are sensitive to more bands. The second platform are the drones. Nowadays, they can be equipped with multispectral cameras that typically include this red edge information. And the nice thing about drones is that they do provide a better quality. For in spectral and spatial resolution, there's a better quality, so you can eliminate the soil influence and correct for that. But you do need, however, good weather conditions. And of course, you need expertise, both in flying and in processing, you need expertise. So drones are mostly used as a service and not by the farmers on their own. And one of the main limitations for applications of drone has been the legal framework so far, which is quite restrictive and is still restrictive with the new European legislation. There's different types of drones, multicopters, the ones that are best known. They can cover smaller areas, but they're quite versatile in sensors that you can use or areas that you can apply them. Fixed wing systems are better for larger areas, several tens of hectares. But there's more issues with permissions, and the landing is a problem because you need a lot of open area to land and take off. And then you have the vertical takeoff and landing, the VTOLs, which are similar. They go into the air with them as a multicopter, and then they take off flying as a fixed wing. Again, you can cover more larger areas with that, but there's issues with permission there. The third platform nowadays are satellite products. Only nowadays, because what's required for precision agriculture purposes is actually quite strict. You need high spatial resolution. You need relevant spectral resolution as well, red near and red edge to be covered. The measurements should be taken frequently, so the low return time is needed, and the data should be immediately available. It doesn't work if you have to wait for a month to getting the data. And also, of course, you are so far away from your field, so the product quality needs to be very well. Radiometric and geometric corrections need to be done really very, very good to apply them. And finally, you need all these requirements, but still you need free or cheap products to actually compete with other things. So up to recently, satellite products were not available for precision agriculture, but since 2015, with the Sentinel-2 MSI satellites, this has changed. They provide quite high resolution data of 10 meter in red, green, blue, near infrared, 20 meter in the red edge, 5-day return time, and very high quality. And they're from ESA, they're completely free. Everybody can download them, or nowadays they can be integrated into agricultural systems. CubeSats are another possibility. They are much smaller satellites that are flying at much lower heights, and they are much cheaper, so they can be launched with tens or dozens at a time. They provide a much higher resolution of 1 to 3 meters, but often a bit more poor in the the spectral resolution, so not including red edge. They do, however, fly at a daily rate, so you can have every day an image, particularly during cloudy conditions. This makes a difference because then the chance of getting an image is much higher. A bit lower quality for the corrections, and it's a paid service. So these are private companies that provide them. So nowadays, this is also an option. Satellites have become an option for precision agriculture. Just as a very quick comparison, this would be one field measured with a tractor, which was a green seeker. So you'd have plots and you'd have blocks where you can take measurements. The same field measured with a UAV, with a drone, given much more detail. And this would be the satellite information you can get for it. So these three systems have their benefits and also their disadvantages. It's hard to say which system or which platform is the best. But in general, a combination of platforms is the best. For instance, if you would have satellite data, you can always use them to actually target when you can fly with a drone or measure with your tractor sprayers. The second part, so we've been talking about assessing spatial information. The second part of precision agriculture is, of course, the decision making. We have measured something, and now you have to say, okay, how much fertilizer do I now need to apply, and which kind of fertilizer? Now, this is where we can still make a lot of progress, to my opinion. For now, we have been working predominantly with semi-empirical models based on these vegetation indices. And there's two kinds of models or methods. The Robin Hood method actually says, okay, if we are measuring, for instance, chlorophyll content, if we see that there's low chlorophyll content, we're going to add more to the areas where the chlorophyll content is lower. So this makes sense, but on the other hand, the King's method says, okay, let's reverse it and see, okay, the areas that are going well, let's provide them with enough nutrients so that they can maximize yield there. And the poorer areas are actually probably not worth investing in. So there's two quite different approaches there. Most of this decision making is done by using enriched strips, particularly when working with tractor-based systems. These are strips in the field that serve as a reference, and they are given enough nitrogen or excess nitrogen. So the vegetation indices you can measure there can be used as a reference as well. So after decision making, of course, you want to apply this in the variable rate application. Now, actually, this technology was available since the late 90s. It's mostly been used for liquid fertilizer, but actually it's also available for solid fertilizer or manure systems. And the numbers vary very drastically within Europe, but in general, it's about 10 to 35% of farms in Europe do have variable rate application available. We see that in general, if you look at questionnaires, there's a large interest from the farmers, but still there's always reasons not to invest in this variable rate application. So these barriers are, for one end, the investment, but actually the additional cost would be about 3.5 euro per hectare, which would be relatively low. Still, we see that this variable rate application is given a lower priority by the farmers. And one of the reasons for that is because it still requires some human effort to get to know these systems, data and knowledge intensive. And this is particularly scaring the older farmers. And in Europe, we do have a large share of older farmers. So we need to work better on convincing farmers of the benefits of this variable rate application infrastructure, because of course, without this, you can't start with precision agriculture. So looking at all this, actually, does precision agriculture work? Can it help to reduce nitrogen or fertilizer inputs? Well, this is a review study that was published 4 years ago. And it's important there that the most of these studies so far were using the simple red and near infrared system, so not even the red edge index. So they're relatively primitive and mostly also using empirical methods. But still, what the studies found that in the large majority, 31 of 34 studies, the N input did decrease, a reduction of about -20% with a large variation, but -20%, that's close to the target from the European Commission. What they did say is that where the data were available, in all of the studies, the nitrogen use efficiency actually increased with a mean of 15% of the studies. Also, the yield was not, well, it was more or less stable, a small increase, which was not significant, but there was no decline in yield. So with less nitrogen input, the yield was actually still stable. And as a consequence, in the large majority of the studies, it was found that there was actually profit to be made by applying precision agriculture. In 28 of the 35 studies, there was actually profit. And this was on average about 37 euros per hectare. So even with these relatively primitive methodologies that are still used nowadays, it actually works. So if we improve our methodologies, we know that we can save a lot of fertilizer, and this could indeed be the low-hanging fruit that we need to make use of for reducing fertilizer input. What further improvements are needed? Well, looking at the spatial variation assessment, we need to make them, particularly the drones, more robust for lesser suited weather conditions. We need to shift from the NDVI towards the red edge-based indices. And well, with the new technology, shortwave infrared can actually give us an idea of the total nitrogen content rather than chlorophyll content. But this is a very expensive technology. So maybe in the future, we can do even better. In decision-making, we need to particularly look at combination of information from multiple platforms and shift from empirical towards radiative transfer or crop growth models that also incorporate water availability and soil conditions, not just look at the vegetation signal, but also at these other signals. And finally, for the variable rate application, well, we need to work on making them more user-friendly and more automated so that be adopted more generally. If we look at some policy...
Wouter, maybe you could keep it very brief because...
Yes. It's my last slide. Okay, so the policy recommendation there is we should stimulate precision agriculture. We should also stimulate the variable rate technology, as well as a remote sensing technology. We should facilitate this. And this was my last slide. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk on precision agriculture and also some of the sensing techniques behind it. Further discussion will be there in the panel discussion later on this afternoon. But I would like to move on to the next speaker, who is a colleague of mine at Radboud University, Professor Mike Yetten. He's a professor in environmental microbiology, got his education at Delft University, spent some time he got his PhD at Wageningen, but went to the US, spent some time in Delft, and now for more than 20 years has been a professor in microbiology at Radboud University. He has been distinguished with many honors and has also received many awards. I will not list them; they are all in the CV that you can also see. I must say that we have seen him very often on pictures where he is in canals in Amsterdam or in muddy creeks somewhere else in the Netherlands, where he is then successful in finding microorganisms that no one else has seen before and that are capable of doing chemical transformations that are very interesting. And I think especially those aspects we will hear about in his lecture. So Mike, please go ahead.
Thank you, Floris. It's a great pleasure and honor to present sustainable nitrogen removal with novel Anamox bacteria. First and foremost, I would like to thank all the past and present co-workers, funding agencies and collaborators who have contributed to the advancement of knowledge in this field. And maybe as a microbiologist, I have a somewhat different view. We live in a microbial world where the role of microorganisms is somewhat overemphasized. And microorganisms have been on this planet for almost 4 billion years. And it's good to realize that for the first 2 billion years, they had to do without oxygen. So life arose and evolved under anaerobic conditions, and also a lot of the biochemistry doesn't need oxygen. And even today, many important ecosystems are devoid of oxygen. And we don't have to go far. Our own intestinal system is nearly completely devoid of oxygen. Large water bodies in the ocean, the oxygen minimum zones, don't have much air. And we have anaerobic sediments and anaerobic wastewater treatment systems. And all of these ecosystems are characterized by the same anaerobic food chain. The polymers, the polysaccharides, the proteins, the lipids are degraded to their respective monomers, sugars, amino acids, fatty acids, and they are further fermented to organic acids, ammonium and hydrogen, and ultimately all end up in methane. A large part of our efforts is in methane microbiology, but for today I will focus on the nitrogen cycle part with an emphasis on ammonia. As already mentioned in earlier presentations today, where we focus on ammonia, ammonium is preferentially used for biomass production, also microbial biomass production, but there are negative side effects. Too much ammonium in water bodies leads to toxicity for aquatic life. The conversion of ammonia draws away oxygen, leading to hypoxia in many water bodies, and also already mentioned, it can lead to the production of nitrous oxide and a greenhouse gas contributing to climate change, and maybe less harmful, it's converted back to dinitrogen gas. So therefore, many good reasons to study nitrogen cycle microbiology, as mentioned, the not so good effects on our planet, but also the beneficial aspect I would like to highlight today. A lot of effort is put into engineering amino acid production to fortify feed or food products, engineering and improving nitrogen fixing genes, and more my own specialty is making nitrogen removal, removing excess nitrogen during wastewater treatment systems. A few words to the engineering. Already for a long time, agricultural wastes are used to make amino acids, especially the nutrient or the limiting amino acids like glutamate, lysine, or arginine are produced in large quantities by companies in Japan, United States, and Europe. And also for these, we genetically engineer mostly corynebacteria to produce these amino acids in large quantities. Another group of microbiologists is busy to engineer microbes and plants. It would be very beneficial if not only the legumes, but also many important cereals could be made to fix their own nitrogen. You see in recent literature more and more efforts to see if it is possible, for example, for corn to fix its own nitrogen. For today, I want to go to the microbial nitrogen cycle. And here we have a classical view that dominated for more than 100 years the textbooks. If we start with dinitrogen gas in the atmosphere, then either free living or microorganisms living in symbiosis can fix nitrogen to the level of ammonium. Preferentially, this goes to Haber-Bosc, but the excess ammonium can be oxidized with oxygen to nitrite and nitrate by nitrifying microorganisms. They are autotrophs consuming CO2, and then the nitrate and nitrite can be reduced all the way back via nitric oxide to nitrous oxide to dinitrogen gas in a process called denitrification. But for this process, you need an electron donor, for example, organic C, and then it contributes to CO2 production. But when we look at the classical view of the nitrogen cycle, then maybe a few possible reactions were missing. And the most notable reaction that was missing was the one where ammonium was oxidized anaerobically, a process in which one ammonium with one nitrite is directly combined into dinitrogen gas. That would also be a CO2 consuming process. So 50 years ago, Engelbert Broda, a theoretical biologist at the Vienna University, wrote a very nice paper about this. He called this lithotropes missing in nature. And there he calculated that the reaction of one ammonium with one nitrite to dinitrogen gas has enough free Gibbs free energy that microorganisms should be able to live on this reaction. Now, some 20 years later, Arnold Mulder was operating a anaerobic wastewater treatment plant at Gis-Brocades, a yeast and penicillin producing factory in the Netherlands. This wastewater had a lot of sulfate and produced a lot of hydrogen sulfide, so he got a lot of complaints from the citizens of Delft. And as a pragmatic wastewater engineer, he bought a lot of calcium nitrate. He put that into the wastewater to suppress the hydrogen sulfide production. The citizens of Delft were happy, no more smelly fumes, but inadvertently, Arnold had created conditions where Anamox bacteria could proliferate. And indeed, about half a year after the additions of the calcium nitrate, he could see that ammonium was disappearing from the anaerobic wastewater treatment system. And Arnold contacted the TU Delft group of Gijs Kuenen to investigate this process and the biology of this process. It's also about the time that I joined TU Delft. And what do? If you study a very challenging process, you go to an inspirational place with your PhD students to get creative new ideas. And then we came up that we needed to have a bioreactor, in this case a sequencing batch bioreactor, to produce enough biomass of the Anamox bacteria to do our experiments. And although we have published many high impact papers, it's also good to mention that good old fashioned journals from societies are very good to publish your ideas, and I think they're even more highly cited than all the high impacts together. At the moment, it has served our purpose to create the biomass to do the experiments, but at the moment we move from a sequencing batcher to a membrane bioreactor where we also could grow the cells somewhat faster and to a higher enrichment density. In the beginning, we were very fascinated by this new process and we wanted to know which microorganisms are carrying out this process and how they do this. This was still an enrichment culture, and to show that really one type of cells was responsible for the Anamox reaction, we had to purify these cells by density gradient centrifugation. We could get a high enrichment, 99+% of the community was Anamox bacteria. And indeed, these purified cell suspensions, they could convert heavy labeled nitrogen, but normal labeled nitrite into 29 dinitrogen gas. These cells also incorporated radioactive CO2, showing that they were autotrophs. And when we sequenced their 16S ribosomal genes, we could show that they belonged to a very special group of bacteria called the Planktomycetes. Once you know the genomic information and you can design diagnostic tools to see where Anamox bacteria occur. And in a European project, it turned out that when we took samples in France, Spain, Italy, Germany, many of these wastewater treatment systems already contained endogenous Anamox bacteria. And also when one of our students had the opportunity to sample different African lakes, she found that in many of these African lakes already Anamox bacteria were flourishing. And even last week we published a paper showing that we haven't yet fulfilled all the Anamox sequence space and that we still can find new Anamox bacteria in anaerobic sediments. How does the Anamox process work? If we start at the level of nitrite, Anamox bacteria reduce this nitrite to nitric oxide in a 1 electron reduction by a nitrite reductase. Then comes the heart of the matter. Anamox bacteria condense nitric oxide with ammonium by an enzyme complex that we have called the hydrazine synthase, making the rocket fuel hydrazine. And in the last step, this hydrazine is oxidized by a hydrazine dehydrogenase to dinitrogen gas, releasing 4 very powerful electrons that go into electron transport chain. Anamox is then able to make a proton motive force, enabling it to conserve energy in the form of ATP. And based on the ability to produce the rocket fuel hydrazine, this has inspired many journalists to write on the Anamox process. And I would say, do not believe everything that journalists write in newspapers. Maybe a fantasy for the very, very far future. In the meanwhile, we have been very interested to see how Anamox bacteria could produce this hydrazine and which enzymes, which biochemistry and enzymes would be involved. Once we had sequenced the genome of the Anamox bacteria, we saw that there was a very conspicuous 3 gene cluster that was highly, highly expressed in the Anamox cells. We were able to purify this gene cluster. And then in collaboration with Thomas Barens from the Max Planck in Heidelberg, we were also able to crystallize this protein to resolve the crystal structure. And with a lot of effort, we were also able to get this protein active again and make it produce hydrazine and in a coupled assay dinitrogen gas. In anaerobic food chain, normally there is plenty of ammonium available for the Anamox bacteria. In the anaerobic sediments and also in anaerobic wastewater treatment systems, it's more a challenge to provide Anamox bacteria with enough nitrite to perform their reaction. And they get their nitrite in natural ecosystem and in engineered ecosystems by cooperating with other nitrogen cycle microbes. And we have investigated several ways how that is possible. If you go then to wastewater treatment systems in mostly Western countries, but now moreover in the world. If you look at the traditional way that nitrogen is removed in wastewater treatment systems, is that the surplus ammonium that is entering the wastewater treatment systems is oxidized with a lot of air into nitrate. And that this nitrate is then with external carbon, mostly in the form of methanol, reduced to dinitrogen gas with significant production of nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. Now, if you would be able to implement the Anamox process in the wastewater treatment system, you would only need half of the oxygen, because you don't need to burn it all to nitrate, but you would like to make a mixture of ammonium and nitrite. And this mixture of ammonium and nitrite can then be converted by the Anamox bacteria to dinitrogen gas. Such a process would, as I said, use 50% less oxygen. It wouldn't need external carbon. It is even an autotrophic process, so it will consume CO2. No or very little emissions of N2O and much less biomass production. And even if you implement it in the right configuration, you could convert a wastewater treatment system from energy using to electricity producing system. And we have done so in collaboration with the TU Delft and a Park company, a biotech company in the north of the Netherlands, who is building many Anamox installations worldwide. Already some time ago, the biggest plant was built in China, 11 tons nitrogen removed per day, but also recently in Zonne and Breugel in the Netherlands, a very large Anamox plant. And they have also a few years ago upgraded the Nijmegen wastewater treatment plant in such a way that also this wastewater treatment plant is now an energy factory. It produces more electricity than it consumes. To round up a few take-home messages, I hope to have shown you that we need to continue to study the fascinating nitrogen cycle microbiology with benefits to our society. Anamox has the intermediate hydrazine, and Anamox can be implemented in more sustainable wastewater treatment systems. Still, there is work for the future. As is also mentioned in earlier presentations today, Anamox is a sustainable process, but it still removes the nitrogen from the system. So people are looking into phototrophic nitrogen capture into biomass, and this biomass could then be used as fertilizer. Or you try to capture the ammonium and ammonium sulfate or in struvite so that you could recover and use the nitrogen. And at the moment, we are busy to see if we can use the surplus ammonium to convert it directly into electricity. And we have then been investigating this together with Coast University. And indeed, we could show that Anamox bacteria also have the capability to convert ammonium into dinitrogen gas and then donate the electrons to an electrode and in this way make electricity. Unfortunately, the efficiency of the process is not that great at the moment and needs to be optimized and scaled up to make this possible. In recent times, I've been interviewed by many different journalists, and not all of them have a biology or a chemical background, but Jenna Brenner from Fox News had it right. New microbes could save the world. And with that, I would leave it. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, for a very inspiring lecture and really fascinating to see what microorganisms can all do. And we'll continue with Professor Bill David from Oxford University, where he is a professor of energy materials chemistry, which is part of the inorganic chemistry laboratory. And he has a broad research interest. So the topics that I see are sustainable and scalable zero carbon chemical and electrochemical energy storage, but also exploring the options for developing ammonia as a green fuel. And I guess that is what his lecture will focus on. It has the intriguing title, Heading for Real Zero, from hydrocarbons to hydronitrogen. So I'm curious what you will telling us, Bill. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed listening to the other side of nitrogen throughout the day. You can probably tell that I'm a physicist because a chemist would never talk about hydronitrogen. But what I guess I'm trying to say in a simple way actually is that I think in some ways, there's a huge opportunity if we want to find the sort of the next in the series of fuels from coal and oil and gas, actually, that we just need to move one element right in the periodic table from carbon to nitrogen. And I'm just going to give an overview of some of my thoughts and some of the things that we've done in this short talk now. So, the industrial revolution has been going for 250 years, and we got coal, and now we're moving to oil and away from oil to gas. And here's methane, and in a way, the best way, if we want to completely remove, the carbon atom and CO2, from our considerations, then the best thing to do, of course, is just to remove it, to decarbonize the molecule itself. And I've just got this little magic thing here where I move one of the hydrogen atoms, and I've gone from CH4 to NH3, and of course, there's nothing magic about hydrogen. And I spent 10 years actually working on hydrogen storage from 2000 to 2010. It's all to do with the energy that's in the chemical bond, and it doesn't care if it's NH or CH. Now, of course, we've got issues to do with greenhouse gases, and there's been a lot of talk about NOx and things like that today. We've thought a lot about that. I'm not going to be touching on that. Perhaps in the questions afterwards, we can see a little bit more. But the point I want to make today, actually, and a lot of what I'm going to be saying actually has come out of a Royal Society Ammonia briefing report that I headed up just before COVID, actually. And if you Google Royal Society Ammonia, then you'll get more of the story there, actually. But I want to talk about the scale of the challenge because we try to extrapolate from where we are now, but really we want to just sit down. There are the easy ways of coming up with some of the numbers that we have to reach. And the BP statistical review, and again, just Google BP statistical review, has been going for 70 years now. And it's a treasure trove of numbers, actually. And on the right-hand side, you won't be able to see it, and I'll come and expand it in a moment. This is primary energy consumption. It's coal, oil, gas, renewables. And down at the bottom right-hand corner that I've actually I've gone and indicated with this red triangle here is the total sort of primary energy consumption actually on the planet, the OECD and the non-OECD and the European Union. And the units these use is exajoules, which sounds like something out of a science movie, actually a science fiction movie. I'm much happier, in fact, thinking about terawatt hours. And if you're looking at the the world as it is actually, and these are the numbers that are just coming on the page that that BP put together in terms of primary energy consumption, we're talking about 161,530 terawatt hours in. I've taken 2019 and 2020 it dipped, so I'm taking 2019 as perhaps a more appropriate number. The EU is down at 16,872 terawatt hours. So I'm going to try and sort of bring that down to something that actually means something. If I divide by the number of hours in a year, so 365 times 24, then I get the number of terawatts that the world is running on average, and it comes out at 18.4 terawatts. Now, terawatt is a million megawatts. It's 1,000 gigawatts. And that's basically what we've got to decarbonize over the next 30 or less years. Actually, that's the number we have to hit. And so the good news is that we can actually produce enough energy from wind and solar to be able to reach that target. I mean, the footprint theoretically is really rather small. And I've got a wind map and a solar, a radiance map of the world here. And it's quite clear just looking at the left-hand side there at these images that most of the green energy opportunities are actually within the tropics. And so there's a huge opportunity in terms of a just transition where the green industrial revolution actually starts in these places. I've just shown the Pilbara in Western Australia, and this is a huge facility. If you look at these little yellow boxes here, actually, these are this is a solar component, and in fact, these facilities actually that are being discussed in this Mauritania, Oman, Egypt, Morocco, Western Sahara, Angola, Namibia, South Africa. There are projects at this sort of level that's been talked about. So this is 26 gigawatts, 26,000 megawatts, 26 gigawatts. We need something the order of 800 of these across the planet, and we've actually hit the 18 terawatts that we're running at. So that's the good news. It's a huge expansion of resource, but it's finite, and it's a number that we can aim for. Just looking at North Africa again, and this is solar, and if you then put on the wind map, you can see, in fact, that there are places like, and this is here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this is the Western Sahara, that's Morocco up there, this is Mauritania down here, this is the Horn of Africa here, and of course there's lots of opportunities in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia as well, but Mauritania up here in the Western Sahara, there's a huge opportunity, and that is 1,500 kilometers, and there's a similar stretch of land actually south of the equator, south of the Congo River Basin, actually in Namibia, Angola, and South Africa. So there's a huge opportunity there, and these are these will be where we get the cheapest green energy in the future. So I wanted to just sort of touch on something and just a way of thinking in terms of energy production. What we need to do is get rid of the right-hand column here. And I'm going to take nuclear and geothermal out just for the moment, although there are options. But I'm looking at things that are ubiquitous. You could call them the global commons. We talked about it at the very beginning of nitrogen and oxygen being absolutely everywhere. So sun, air, and water. And actually, our renewable energy production is essentially relying on the global commons: sun, air, and water. And I just pose a question now. So we've talked about battery storage. Half my group's actually working on sodium batteries, half are sodium batteries. But with these global commons, can we store our energy as well as produce our energy from these global commons? And then we will have an essential ubiquity of resource. And well, you know where I'm heading actually, but it's interesting because the first thing, if you look at 95% of the stored energy on the planet at the moment is actually pumped hydroelectricity. Here we have using gravity, which you could argue is another global commons. It's it's there and ubiquitous, and we are pushing water uphill actually, which again is essentially more ubiquitous than many of the other things that we talked about earlier on. So we're on the right track actually in terms of asking the question and answering it. If we talked about batteries at the and we talked about lithium, and I would argue actually the high power sodium batteries are already actually, they're 2 years off actually matching a lot with what you can do with lithium. So that's a good thing from that point of view. The cumulative lithium ion production capacity. So that's actually every year building year on year the number of terawatt hours. We're around about 1 terawatt hour at the moment, 6 terawatt hours by 2030. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 6 terawatt hours and see how long can I power the planet for, because it's running at 18.4 terawatts. And the answer is we get 20 minutes for all the accumulated lithium ion battery capacity that we're going to get in the 2020s. We will be able to power the world for 20 minutes. Now, I mean, batteries are not a long-term storage, but we do need to at some point get that 20 minutes up to 12 hours. And so we've got that's a factor of 36. We need to go between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude more in terms of our electrochemical global performance, as it were, capacity. And that 2 orders of magnitude is a big stretch. An order of magnitude is probably feasible, but that's the challenge. But that will only deal with the short-term issues, because 20 minutes and a day does not actually get us over the interseasonal challenges that we have. I spent 10 years working on hydrogen storage. with a lot of people from the DOE, you know, folk in Europe, Germany, France, elsewhere actually, and the Far East. Basically, you know, we pulled the plug on hydrogen back in 2008-9, actually, when the DOE in the States actually pulled the plug. And Stephen Chu, who was the Secretary of Energy at the time, he said there's 4 miracles for the hydrogen economy. There's the steam reforming of methane that we've talked about. And I'm actually very optimistic about the price of green ammonia going down quite quickly if we actually start producing our energy in places like Mauritania and Namibia. The storage, again, you know, we still have not sorted out large-scale storage. People talk about salt mines and pipelines, but these are not, in my mind, actually practicable ways forward. Fuel cells aren't there yet. And we could talk a lot about that actually, but and then the distribution infrastructure isn't there. Now, this is hydrogen refueling stations across the planet. At the end of 2019, there were 470. So in terms of that's 7,000 tons per year from these facilities. You know, it's not ubiquitous and it's very sporadic across the planet. Again, if I do that in terms of how long can I run the planet for, at this point, it's now 10 seconds. So it's simply not at a point where we're talking about doing all this in terms of hydrogen for transportation, and we simply are so far off the mark. It's embarrassing, actually. If you look at the global liquid hydrogen production, actually 355 tons a day it stands at the moment, that will actually get you running for 14 minutes, actually. So it's comparable with what lithium batteries are going to be able to do. But of course, with lithium batteries, you can charge and recharge them again. This is the yearly production of liquid hydrogen. And so you know, we all know about ammonia, and it's good that you know, we're in an audience who know about the fact that you know, ammonia is shipped internationally and has been for many a year actually, and there's already 25 million tons a year of international trade. And most of you will think about that actually in terms of fertilizers and urea and ammonium nitrate and things like that. I think of it in terms of the fact that we're shipping 100 terawatt hours per year of fuel, not green fuel at the moment, around the planet in the form of ammonia. There's 182 million tons per year actually. That's 730 terawatt hours. So I'm going to do the sum now for 730 terawatt hours in terms of how long can I power the planet for? And the answer is about 40 hours. And that makes sense actually, because about 2% of the energy that we have actually is used to produce ammonia, and this is coming in at just under 1%, because you don't get so much energy from the ammonia as you do from petrol and diesel. It's still very significant, much more significant than lithium batteries. But the point I'm saying here is actually we're at a stage where you know, ammonia as it stands at the moment, you know, it's by a mile, by 2 orders of magnitude, 3 orders of magnitude in the case of hydrogen, there in terms of being able to scale up to be the surrogate to the fossil fuels of the future. These are numbers, and I can say where we got them from at the later on actually, and I'm aware that I'm moving on in terms of my time. You know, if you look at the breadbasket of the United States, there's over 1,000 facilities in Iowa. You look at Los Angeles, where they don't like to have the idea of ammonia in the city, and these are refrigeration facilities, ice rings. There's 100,000 tons of ammonia sitting behind the port of Los Angeles. This one here is a Chevron facility actually that's sitting you know, up the coast a bit towards Santa Monica. This is actually just straight off Google Maps. It really does exist. But the thing that and we're working on ammonia for aviation is that this is Los Angeles runway. We're sitting with a 30,000 ton facility actually that's you know, multi-gigawatt hours, terawatt hours of storage just in its own right. So I'm moving sort of into the final stage of what I want to say actually, and just to say that it's not just chemical storage, it's not electrochemical storage. It's a compound of things that we need to be able to do. I believe with solar and wind, and there's talk certainly in the UK about small modular nuclear reactors and AMRs and things like that as well. They may well be part of the story. But what we want to be able to do is we want to, if we've made our electricity, to be able to use it you know, immediately. If we can do that, then there's no need to store it. But our supply and demand are rarely actually 100% aligned one with the other. So in terms of small, short steps, we got pumped hydro, so but batteries are there to play, a large role in the future. But as I said before, we've got to really increase that capacity by 2 orders of magnitude from where we are at the moment. And that is a challenge, and we need extra bandwidth. I believe sodium-ion batteries are going to do that. If we're looking at the large scale long term, we're talking about days to interseasonal. We have to be able, certainly in the north of Europe, to be able to store the energy in the summer, to use it in the winter. My belief actually is that we will have ships. I mean, they're talking about that in Rotterdam already. That's coming from places like Namibia. Our fuel, our green fuel, will be shipped around the world, most likely in terms of ammonia. In fact, I mean, it's I would bet 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, on for ammonia being the one. But what I wanted to say here is that we're talking about, I think what Mark was talking about, the circular economy. Here's another circular economy, actually, in terms of looking at it in energy terms. And actually, it's interesting because across Europe, we're talking about hydrogen as being the hydrogen economy, and nobody can really describe what it is. Hydrogen is a 20-second transient, a 30-meter transient in the Haber-Bosc SMR process, or in the oil refinings, SMR and oil refining. It moves, a few meters. It lasts for a few seconds. That's most hydrogen does not hang around for a long time, actually. So hydrogen is not the main player in the frame here, actually. Again, looking at pumped hydro, that's gravitationally energized water. NH3 is chemically energized water, and of course, there are really no issues with resource. And so, what I want to do, this is my last slide, actually, is to say that if we're able to get this green industrial revolution going, where the fuel that's coming across the oceans is not methane any longer, or oil, but is ammonia, and we have the huge mega facilities of wind and solar that, in principle, in time will be able to do that. Costs will come down. In the sunniest and windiest parts of the planet, the costs will be low in terms of operational costs, and so there's a huge opportunity here. We stand to democratize energy in the just transition that's talked about a lot in the IPCC, but also, of course, ammonia. And this is, in some ways, the other side of the coin, talking about energy here, that it's part of the food, water, energy nexus. One of the things I should have said, actually, is that most of these big facilities are going to be right by the side of the ocean. So we're actually going to be using desalination. We will be producing pure water to be able to, or desalinated water to be able to use and to create our ammonia. That water, of course, can be used for many other things. So here's the water ammonia cycle. I'm not going to put hydrogen. I'm not going to give it a headline here, because I think, as I say, it's a transient that lasts for seconds and for meters, and that basically we've got 6H2O plus 2N2 goes to 4H3N plus 3O2. And so we've basically gone from air hydride 1, which I'm calling H3N, to air hydride 2 and back again. And so that's, I really want to finish there and leave you with what I think is a very promising virtual circle for the future. And in some ways, the only option that we've got if we want to remove the carbon atom for what we're able to do in terms of storage, and particularly long-term storage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. So the title has become much more clear for me, and it's a very interesting idea to have ammonia as a hydrogen, or as an energy carrier. In fact, I'm sure there will be there's a lot to discuss about this. There will also be questions about this. So again, please put them in the Q&A box, and then we will have those questions.
So I'll say one thing, actually. Thank you very much for quickly correcting yourself. It's an energy carrier. It's not a hydrogen carrier.
Yeah, no, so that's...
It's not a hydrogen carrier. It's a molecule in its own right. And hydrogen, I do not believe, is the follow-on from methane. I do believe it's ammonia.
Thank you.
You taught yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for pointing that out again. but I think the discussion will continue later on, Will. Yeah, thanks for now. Yeah, so the next lecture is slightly different. Will be given by Mark Sutton, who we have seen also before this morning, so I will not introduce him any further. But he was present at the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly that was held in Nairobi in Kenya. Where he was involved in sort of defending that there should be a resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. And I think it's very interesting to hear from him firsthand how such a process evolves during such an assembly. So Mark, I gladly give you the word to well, tell us how things went there.
Thanks, Floris. And can you see the screen?
Yeah, this looks good.
Great. Yeah. So thanks very much. And following on from Bill, this really is something slightly different. So take all your science, distill it into your head, and start going to talk to policymakers. They're coming from a completely another place. It's exceptionally time consuming. And so actually what I'm going to show here is actually a bit of the path up to the resolution on sustainable nitrogen management, which has been adopted this February at the United Nations Environment Assembly. So let's just start off first. What is the United Nations Environment Assembly? It's the highest level United Nations decision-making body on the environment. It's been said by New Scientist, the world's parliament on the environment. It's also the governing body of the United Nations Environment Programme. Actually, that tension is a bit of a tension between is it doing one or the other. And it's the way is prepared by what's called the Committee of Permanent Representatives. That is all of the ambassadors based in Nairobi, who then are basically the governing board of UNEP. But in fact, there are two nitrogen resolutions, and I'm going to have to show you a bit of both to explain the story. And this helps, as scientists, as engineers, how does one engage with the world of policy? It's slow. And the key thing is that you need some countries that want to take action. So the way we worked at it was through the International Nitrogen Management System. It's a project funded by the Global Environment Facility through UNEP. And we worked with a group of countries in September 2017 with the South Asia Cooperative Environment Programme. And there we made a draft resolution. The first resolution took 45 minutes to write. Then it's developed by a group over a day or so. And then from there, it's sent up to the Governing Council of SACEP. You've got the ministers, the Director General, all the different players. We've got to get the ball across from the right to the left. And that's where you need a lead country. And we had various meetings with the Indian government. India came in and said, yes, they're ready to lead that process, bringing it to the Committee of Permanent Representatives, who then work through it on a several-month basis. And finally, it goes to the week before the United Nations Environment Assembly, called the Open-Ended Committee of Permanent Representatives, where it's negotiated. And if you're lucky, it survives. And what that did is establish the first resolution, established something called the Nitrogen Working Group that's going to take things forward. As scientists, we also want to distill our science in another way, and we contributed by making a report to the UNEP Frontiers report entitled The Nitrogen Fix. And at the hub of that conversation was that the different UN conventions are fragmented and not working together. And we identified the need among various options to establish a coordinating mechanism, not a new convention, but get those existing conventions working together between air, climate, water, biodiversity, and there's INMS at the bottom, providing scientific resource. And then, of course, we identify our champions. You get the forward there, the key messages coming through out on social media, etc. That, I think, is a key part, not to forget that it's not just the conversation in the room, but the conversation in the room is stimulating a global conversation. Here then is the first resolution, which was coming through in March 2019. There's nothing about quantitative goals. That was not that would be too ambitious at that point. At this point, it was just get nitrogen on the table, say that nitrogen is something that the world should be having a conversation about in the UN system. And there you can see in yellow the key paragraph considering the options for better coordination across the global nitrogen cycle, including the case to establish an intergovernmental coordination mechanism on nitrogen policies. So that has moved forward. That led to the establishment of the nitrogen working group, and that is now working indeed on this question of how to go forward. The next step, rapidly afterwards, and this is more meetings, there's me in a press conference in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka said, we were not effective enough in the first resolution. We want to take action. Come and work with us. Our president is our environment minister. Let's make it happen. That led to the launch of the UN global campaign on sustainable nitrogen management in Colombo with about 1,000+ people. And it led to the agreement and signing of the Colombo Declaration by 14 member states of the UN. It's available online. You can see the first lines there. And here was the first step towards quantitative action in an ambition. And there we are. So develop national roadmaps for sustainable nitrogen management with an ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. This is not a hard commitment. This is pointing the direction. This is something we need to do. And in order to get there, the national roadmaps or the national action plans are going to be a key step forward. One of the lines further down the page on that Colombo Declaration was that the countries would cooperate in bringing these kind of ideas to a new resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly. Obviously, with COVID in the middle, things slowed down. The UNEA 5 was divided into two parts. One part last year with no resolutions, the second part this year with the resolutions. The other thing happened is that the Colombo Declaration was being watched by others, and we're aware that the European Commission took great note of it when they've come up with their farm to fork strategy some 7-8 months later. And you'll note that reduced nutrient losses by at least 50% is part of that. And they've actually added other goals here, including reducing use of fertilizers by 20%. But we know that the Colombo Declaration helped inform that UN strategy for the EU. Now, the EU became a key supporter of the next resolution. There's also a goal there, organic farming. And here we are. Here's the new resolution that has been followed up. So the same process there, in this case, Sri Lanka leading the engagement with all the member states, bringing it to the table at UNEA, and ultimately leading to this document. In fact, I was privileged to take part because I took part as a member of the Sri Lankan delegation engaging in the negotiation, a very exciting place. I think scientists are in a strong position because we know the science well. Equally, we have to be careful ourselves not to get too passionate in this international negotiation world. So there's the draft resolution, and here are some of the key paragraphs out of that, taking note of the launch, the Colombo Declaration. And number one, encourages member states to accelerate actions to significantly reduce nitrogen waste globally by 2030 and beyond. You note that they did not agree half. In fact, if you look at other negotiations with the CBD, there are several countries blocking agreement to go to half. There's a whole nother conversation there. But what is really interesting is the engagement with civil society, because the moment that resolution failed to achieve half, there's a whole conversation with civil society about why not, how far can you go, etc. And you can see that also in 3B, it's identifying the possible modalities moving forward with that development of the interconvention nitrogen coordination mechanism. So there we are. That's the process that's happening, is raising global awareness about the need to take action. We're seeing the NGOs coming on board, understanding gradually why the nitrogen cycle is just as important as the carbon cycle. It's taking forward this recognition of the need for better coordination of nitrogen policies, such as through an interconvention nitrogen coordination mechanism. And that's going to have to be fleshed out further in the next year or so. And it's also preparing the way to other processes. An illustration is the COP15. That's the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. They have now a similar goal. Of course, we've been coordinating to halve nutrient inputs, 50% reduction in nutrient inputs And we're already seeing many of the same countries pushing forward. The EU is supportive. On the other hand, many other countries not wanting to go to that halving. And finally, it's developing a conversation about nitrogen waste, that it's a waste of resources. And I think this is an interesting meeting we're having today, because this is a definition that we had in the UNECE a couple of years ago, that it's the sum of all losses to the environment, including N2 and reactive nitrogen forms. I think perhaps we're going to need to tune this because as we come on board with this conversation about nitrogen as an energy carrier, ammonia as an energy carrier, it might be an less productive use of is made of it, because obviously if we can get the electricity back out of it, then it wouldn't be a waste. So let's look to the future for further finessing these words as we have this conversation about nitrogen waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting to see. Very interesting to get some inside information of how those processes evolve, and they for sure are also very time consuming and involve a lot of discussions and meetings before a resolution is there, I guess. But it's good to see that the resolution is now finally there, and to get this information firsthand, I would say. Thank you for that. The next lecture in the program is then from Professor Sarah Cornell, who is a global environmental change scientist. That is an interesting job description, I must say. She is a associate professor at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, where she is leading a group that seeks to integrate global perspectives into social ecological systems approaches for dealing with the risks, resource use, and societal responses to environmental challenges. That is another mouthful, but I think we will hear what this means, but then connect it to nitrogen that we have been discussing today. So Sarah, I gladly give you the screen, I should say, to sort of elaborate on all of this.
Thank you. And thank you too, Mark, for the whiz-bang tour of the UNEA process. The wonderful thing about going last is that many of the themes that I want to raise have already been touched on. So we'll be able to also have a little bit of a whiz-bang tour through Earth system science, sustainability itself, and of course, how it relates to the nitrogen cycle. The two themes that I really want to focus on are quantification, so I'm pleased that Mark mentioned that just now, and actually connection, and the two little figures in the diagram on my first slide here. I hope I'll have a chance at the end to talk about them a little bit more, but they represent the simplest possible diagram of the nitrogen cycle at its global scale, and particularly the quantified human disturbance of the nitrogen cycle. And on the other side, a network diagram of the very many different legal instruments, the policies and the legal documents relating to nitrogen management. There we go. So let's talk about nitrogen from a planetary perspective. Planet Earth is, I mean, fortunately for those of us who like quantifying things, it's a physical planet. And for many decades now, the quantified understanding of how heat and water and materials and energy are balanced on the planet and how they are circulated around the planet become the basis of our global climate models. But it's not just a physical planet. I mean, obviously, physics is a phenomenally powerful scientific approach for this because it allows us to have predictive power for the climate system. But Earth is also a living planet. And so the reason that many of us have sort of moved into the field of Earth system analysis is, well, physics only works for physics, and a living planet we can regard as a co-evolutionary planet between life and the physical environment, life and the physical climate. And Earth system analysis is really the process of trying to characterize. Notice I haven't used the word quantify here, although quantification is important. We're trying to understand the system behavior of, again, mass and energy exchanges, but we understand them in terms of feedbacks too, in this co-evolutionary process of the physical environment, the geosphere, and the living environment, the biosphere. And on top of that, we now really are becoming more and more aware that it's a human planet. And people, enabled by the technologies that we've created for ourselves, have the capacity to make really quite disruptive perturbations to the ecology, to the chemical processes, and particularly biogeochemical processes, and actually even the fundamental physical conditions of Earth itself. Every time we alter these fundamental feedbacks between life and its physical environment, we're making the behavior of the system less predictable. And I want you to sort of hold this idea in mind, that we're sort of pushing the system away from the very well characterized system that we have encoded, let's say, in our physical climate models. So I'm also delighted that people have already raised long time frames and microbial life. And I'm going to skip away from nitrogen. I also am very grateful that Mark mentioned reactive forms of elements as well. So I'm going to give one example of how life changes the Earth system and actually ends up having to change itself as well. One very well-known example that's very often in textbooks, in geology textbooks all around the world, is what is often called the Great Oxygenation Event, which was when life on Earth really picked up on the wonderful innovation of photosynthesis, really forming oxygen. It changed the chemistry of the oceans. And we see that chemistry, the record of the changing chemistry of the oceans, in the banded iron formations that are present in very many places around the world. It was a global change. And we see it as it was also reflected in a change in the chemistry of the atmosphere. The oxygen that was released from the ocean really very rapidly oxidized the methane-rich atmosphere in that ancient Earth, changed the greenhouse effect, and again, the climatic changes changed what life was possible. It's not the only time life has changed the Earth system and been changed itself. One example that I like, because in some ways it affects the stability of our Earth right now, was what many describe as the result of an ecological arms race between the great predators of the ancient oceans. This is maybe only 150 million years ago, 200 million years ago or so. And these predators were, like I say, there was predatory pressure on an awful lot of life forms in the ocean at that time. And one of the innovations that our life on Earth created then was to move from being sedentary organisms attached to the sort of sea floor in these shallow coastal zones of the time to become plankton. And the shift to plankton forms, and actually forms in the deep ocean sediments as well, were linked to reactive carbon, or specifically also to unreactive carbon. The calcification of this plankton was a really important function in drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. It established what we now have as the carbonate equilibrium, and what we now have as the chemical mechanism and the biological mechanism for drawing CO2 from the atmosphere down into the ocean. This has buffered climate, so we can talk about relatively stable climatic conditions as a result of this ocean chemistry. And of course, the life in the oceans is what we would regard as conferring resilience now to ocean acidification, a global concern for us. And right now, we're in a situation where we know that people are also changing the world. And we don't know yet if the scale of the transition is as big as the mass extinctions that were associated with the Mesozoic revolution or the Great Oxygenation. I mean, there's an awful lot more species on Earth now than there were. Can I really say that? Back in the very, very deep history of Earth, certainly more diverse species. And many of these, I mean, you've seen the planetary boundaries photograph visualization several times already today, but they really highlight that people are changing the biophysical functioning of the whole planet. They're changing the world. We've talked about carbon emissions and climate already. My old examples from ancient Earth have also talked about the changes, not just in the atmosphere and the climate system, but in the chemistry of the ocean and how that affects life. And we've seen many, many discussions too about just how much reactive nitrogen human activities are mobilizing at the global scale. And of course, it's not just nitrogen. Many other biogeochemical changes are happening at the same time. And we are creating, let's say, ultra-potent, bioaccumulative, extremely persistent substances that kind of bypass the natural self-correcting mechanisms of the biosphere. So one thing that I really want to emphasize, of course, is that changing the biogeochemistry of the whole planet is a big thing. It's not just a little bit of nitrogen, losses, or whatever the phrase that we have used for so many years as nitrogen scientists. When you take this planetary perspective, and when you set today's changes into the context, not just of a few decades, but of millions of years, then we start to really recognize how big the shift is in the way that the planet works. You've already seen this picture. Back in 2009, my colleague Johan Rockström and the other authors of the Planetary Boundaries paper proposed that a nitrogen boundary should just be quite simply that, we turn off the tap of this human-caused perturbation to the nitrogen cycle. And in a sense, they're absolutely right. We do need, if we want a stable climate system for the long term and a stable ecosystem that we are part of for the very long term, then this kind of perturbation really needs to be tackled head on. But it's not a simple tap that you can just turn on and off again. Life is already adapting to this profound disturbance. It's already adapting to shifts in nutrient limitation and nutrient ratios. You can't just poke the red wedge back in again to some kind of notional Holocene. So that's challenge one, if you want to think of it like that. There are many scientists who sort of responded to the Planetary Boundaries framework and who are continuing to discuss it to see how useful it can be, especially as we try to go from our scientific understanding of the way that the Earth system works to our societal responses to unsustainability. Wim de Vries and colleagues wrote about really, since we can't poke the red wedge back in, at least let us avoid the worst impacts. I like this work very much, but it does also raise the question of what are the worst impacts? Are they the ones that we see as human beings, see in the here and now? How do we deal with the very diffuse, the very long-term systemic changes that we know that we're also causing? And of course, this is a main topic that we've discussed already a little bit today. Colleagues in Finland wrote that a planetary boundary needs to be balanced out in some way to meet the global demand for food. We've also heard today that the global demand for food is itself a really complicated story with overconsumption in parts of the world, underconsumption in others. Again, I would say this is a challenge that needs all of our expertise to come around the table and discuss. But it definitely, food especially, shows us just how much the nitrogen cycle is both a planetary issue and an issue for everyday human life and the choices that we make. So to wrap up that part of the Earth system perspective, I would agree global numbers tell us a very, very important story. But I want you all to remember too that quantifications on their own can actually hide the complexity of the system. And this is particularly important for nitrogen. Nitrogen isn't a story of physics and simple equations, and actually it's not a simple matter of supply and demand either. One thing I didn't say just now with the food thing is that over and under consumption of Earth's resources are actually an issue of social justice, of environmental justice, and in many cases they're profoundly unfair. So, message one from the Earth system science perspective is quantification is important, but equally important is understanding the system behind the numbers. So let's skip over to the question of sustainability for a moment. I often go back to the 1987 Brundtland report. It's one of the founding documents of global sustainability policy. It's a political document, so there's a lot to disagree with, but I think there's two things that I particularly like, and I think that are important. One is it sets out an aim for sustainable development, this promoting harmony among human beings and between humanity and nature. This aim recognizes connection and it recognizes interdependence. It also doesn't leave it just hanging there at some kind of nice utopian statement. It pinpoints the many social systems that need to be taken into account. What I like about the Brundtland report compared to some of the more recent policy documents on global sustainability is that each of these social systems is described as active. Just to give these examples, it secures participation in decision-making, or it is flexible and can self-correct. They're active and they are purposive. They're doing something for something. And I find that useful in a system, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. In many ways, the Brundtland report lets me say what sustainability is. It's a process. It's not the sum of a number. Although numbers and targets are vitally important. It's a process of integrating diverse perspectives, diverse activities, and specifically also the many, often very divergent purposes that we might have for our social systems that need to live within the ecosystems of which we're part. So the closing question on today's long list of very important questions was, can we actually say anything at all about the sustainable use of nitrogen? And I want to just sort of flag a couple of challenges or pinpoint them. I've already mentioned them and we've heard about them already today in other talks. We have very patchy knowledge of the nitrogen system at its global scale. And this patchy knowledge means that very often different groups of scientists and different groups of nitrogen users, if you want to think of us like that, have different stories to tell about the sustainability problem. We gathered we still don't have a global nitrogen assessment that does everything that we wanted to do. But we have many, many partial assessments, either focused on the scientific exchanges of what's going on. We mentioned the European nitrogen assessment earlier this morning. We have data that are gathered primarily for science itself in the sort of pure fundamental understanding of what's going on. And of course, we have monitoring and measurement of many, many nitrogen-related issues that have already caused social impacts. Very often those aren't particularly compatible though, and they work at different scales. So there's a fundamental challenge here of how we deal with the infrastructure for understanding nitrogen, as well as we understand, for instance, carbon. I also want to sort of come back to the point that it's very easy to take a profoundly human-centric perspective rather than an ecological perspective, recognizing that we are a species among many. And that when major biogeochemical perturbations or climate perturbations have happened in the past, they have tended to rip quite large holes out of the web of life. I love this picture. I recommend you go and have a look at it because I'm certainly not going to explain it. But the holes in the web of life are related to, very often have been related to external drivers of mass extinctions. But like I say, things like our plankton and our cyanobacteria remind us that we can have endogenous changes to the system too. And finally, I want to sort of really just emphasize as well that an awful lot of our science has so far been Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, and I'm putting democratic in scare quotes right now, rather than actually being representative and inclusive of the lived experience of people around the world. What stories do we tell about the nitrogen problem? What is the problem represented to be? And we've already had a little bit of discussion about it being both over and under consumption. It's often useful to sort of at least ask ourselves to look at more than one perspective on each of the issues that is coming to the policy table when it comes to handling and managing nitrogen for the longer run. So I'd like to say that we should be optimistic about bringing nitrogen into the sustainability conversation at this global scale. We have detailed knowledge about the processes of change. We have political systems that connect us across scales, and a lot of our discussion here is obviously around Europe, because that's where most of us I'm in Europe and the EuChemS is in Europe, but obviously we're not just in Europe. Every part of our everyday life is connected through supply chains, through financial systems, and fundamentally through ecological systems too, to everywhere else in the world across scales. The other positive outlook, I think, is that we have a global commitment to a fairer world through the 2030 agenda. So if we hold on to these ideas of that our connectivity and our power for quantifying and understanding the system, then I think we're pretty well equipped. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for sort of wrapping up many things that have been said today. What I remember from your lecture definitely is that the nitrogen story is not simply a matter of supply and demand. And I think that with this sort of view of a system scientist, you have integrated various things that we have seen before in other lectures. And I'm sure we will come back to some of the things that you have been telling us in the discussion that we will start in a few minutes. So thank you very much for your contribution also. Well, that leads me to the panel discussion then, to close today. We have 1 hour. I'm not sure whether we are going to use the entire hour, but I would like to invite the lecturers of this afternoon to share. Yeah, so indeed to show the video, and then we can go to the questions that were there. But before we go to the questions in the Q&A box, I would like to raise the issue not only to you, but primarily also to the participants, that we cannot see what should be the next element, or what should be the next elements that we should highlight, discuss in such a webinar. So the first one was on carbon, the second one was on lithium, as Nicola explained this morning. The third one now is on nitrogen. The fourth one will actually be on phosphorus. But the question is, what other elements should we discuss? Which are the most urgent ones or the most interesting ones to discuss? Should that be a metal again? Should it be cobalt or nickel or rhodium perhaps? Should it be another element? Helium could be one. Hydrogen has been mentioned many times today. Or should there be another one? Is there a particular view of any of the panelists here that would like to
I can't believe I'd suggest it, but I'd go sulfur. I spent half of my career complaining to my colleagues for getting too much sulfur science on, but do it.
So my first thought actually was catalysis actually, and there, I guess platinum is is one of the key elements in that one actually. So that's but I mean gold also is a good catalyst, but platinum was the first one that came to mind actually.
Yeah. So when it comes to catalysts, then many metals, I guess, can be mentioned. Yeah. Mark?
Yes, I'll add in phosphorus. We spend a lot of time, people love to club them together as nutrients, which is very optimistic and positive. It doesn't sound like a problem, but there are big issues with phosphorus, and they're not all the same with nitrogen. And the phosphorus discussion becomes even more contentious because of issues of land rights.
Yeah, but the next one will be on phosphorus. So later this year, most likely by the end of November or beginning of December, there will be one on phosphorus. So that one is definitely going to be organized. Now maybe Martin can put up the poll so that we can so that all the participants can vote. We put some elements already over there, but feel free to add another if you feel that is more appropriate or more urgent to discuss. So we'll just leave the poll there for a while. And then there are questions that are, I would say, rather specific in the Q&A, but I think it will be good to not only have the written answers from the presenters, but also the answers. And maybe we can start with Rune to address some of the questions that were more specifically about your lecture. There are some very simple technical ones. So for example, you showed that you were converting ammonium hydrogen carbonate into the corresponding nitrate, and the question was what does happen to the carbon? Yeah, please unmute Rune.
The carbon is being released. The CO2 carbon is being released to the atmosphere.
Yeah, that was what I figured as well. Do you see the question in the Q&A? There's also one about the plasma treatment. So are there any losses in terms of formation of NOx or the nitrous oxide?
Yeah, we are studying and balancing between two mechanisms. There is a biological loss mechanism that we are stopping with the treatment of the plasma and the nitrite and pH combination. And once we have stabilized, inhibited the biology, then we establish a composition that is chemically stable, which means the unstable nitrogen oxides like the nitrite is then oxidized to nitrate, for instance. So this is what we are studying now. The reason why I'm putting up nitrogen loss is that since we have both plasma reactor and we have other ways of dealing with the nitrous oxide, we can always deal with the nitrous oxide in the process and at the storage.
Yeah. And another question is that you also showed that nitrate is added to the process, and so what is the source of that nitrate that you?
the source is the air plasma. The air plasma, nitrogen is oxidized to NO and then to NO2. And in the absorption process of NO and NO2, you get nitrates and nitrites.
Yeah.
To make it simple, you get a lot of other things as well, but those are the key components.
Yeah. Yes, that clarifies the answer.
So the bulk of the neutralization, the bulk of the stopping the ammonia loss is the nitrate. The nitrite is there to stop the biology. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another question that is about the collection of the manure and urine. I think you indicated that it's important to not wait too long with the treatment of that.
Yeah, because if you take a cow grazing in the field, she's dropping urine and feces directly to the field, and that in that situation there is a minimum of loss mechanisms. The urine is soaked up down into the soil before the hydrolyzation and the enzymes can start to attack it, and the feces is exposed to oxygen, so you don't get a lot of methane. But if you store everything together, you get two mechanisms. One, the first is that you hydrolyze the urine immediately with the urease enzymes in the slurry, and you start converting the organic material to methane and ammonia.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. Then there is a question to Wouter, which is about how much do you gain with this technology? I think you gave an indication of that, but does it sort of compensate for now the investment that you have to do in developing the technology that obviously also has a carbon footprint, and does it outweigh like the advantages and disadvantages that you most likely will have?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and well, how much fertilizer is actually saved, that very much depends on the conventional and reference system, so to say. But it's most studies do find large reductions, and suppose that you can save easily up to 20% of the conventional in comparison with the conventional systems. This would lead to about 60 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare, of 60 kilogram of fertilizer, sorry, per hectare, which be this is 60 kilogram with current cost would be at least about 45 to 50 euro per hectare. So that's quite a lot per hectare. So now, is it actually worth it? Well, I don't know whether anybody has done the carbon footprint of the full methodology. If you would take, for instance, the satellite data as input, the carbon footprint would be very, very low. But of course, there's already a large carbon footprint related to the 60 kilogram per hectare that you would save, because fertilizer is very energy intensive to make. So I'm pretty positive that even with the other methods, it wouldn't be, the carbon footprint would definitely be lower as well. Drones, they use batteries and not a lot of batteries, and the other system, the tractor-based system, can be put on the tractors. These sensors can all be reused, so I'm not too worried about that. The other thing is, of course, how much is the investment worth the savings? And I think this is the key question. That's always a bit the doubt also about among the farmers. It's also not just about the cost; it's also about the amount of input required from the farmers to invest in this, just the learning thing. So we are convinced that it is worth it, and maybe it's something that Mark already mentioned this morning. Up to recently, or very recently, the nitrogen prices were actually too low. They were not reflecting the actual costs of the nitrogen. So with the increasing nitrogen prices, probably it will be more convincing for most farmers, or farmers will be more convinced to invest in this technology. So all in all, I think the technology is worth investing in. One other question was that, are we not making them more dependent on technological solutions? Yes, in a way that we would be needing technological solutions for precision agriculture, but I'm not sure, I'm not too pessimistic about that. I don't think that there's something necessarily wrong with that. We can also embrace this extra technology as we have been doing with other kinds of technology. So I'm still very much in favor of the technology.
Yeah, that's clear. Yeah. And so, Mike, I think you answered the question meantime, but the essence of the question is, I think that if you lower the oxygen level in the waste treatment plants, wouldn't it go automatically, or would this Anamox become more active, or would that process not start with, I guess, microorganisms that are there?
There were several questions, indeed. In the beginning, when there were no Anamox installations, startups were indeed very long, 3 to 12 months, but there is no limitation in seed available. There are more than 200 installations worldwide, so there is enough seed to start new installations. I would say be friendly and ask for a seed, and then you can start up within a month. And yes, controlling the oxygen is the key. Have just enough oxygen so that you make a mixture of ammonium and nitrite, and that will do the trick. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that these were the technical questions that were answered. Yeah, so if there have meanwhile are there any questions from panelists that gave lectures this morning that were answered or that were challenged in the afternoon? I personally was triggered by something that Mark said this morning, and I think also repeated briefly this afternoon about the waste, or the nitrogen waste. And essentially, you all say that denitrification, like the Anamox process, is actually something we also, that we should not do, or that is considered something that is sort of redundant in principle. Or could you elaborate on that, Mark?
Yeah, thank you. And I do have a specific question for Mike to elaborate on back in return, which was about, with the Ammonox process having, let's say, half the amount of oxygen, does that lead to an operational challenge that's more tight with performance? And how easy is it to control that more precisely? Or is it no more precise than the old methods? But to come to your question, I think that's what I was hinting at the end. Let's finesse that a bit more, because if you imagine denitrification in an old style wastewater plant, or in non-catalytic reduction, with non-catalytic reduction of NOx, you add ammonia, or like you add blue, and you have 2 nitrogen atoms, and you come out with no nitrogen atoms. You've used stuff to denitrify and come out with no reward whatsoever. And clearly that's a waste of resources of 2 nitrogen atoms. Similarly, if you've got a denitrification-based wastewater with nitrous oxide-based approach, then you're putting in energy to destroy nitrogen again. Now, I think Mike has added in an interesting one, arguing that if you use an Ammonox process, actually it's electricity producing. And clearly in Bill's conversation about ammonia as a fuel, that's its purpose. Its purpose is as an energy carrier. So I think perhaps we need to reframe this a bit more and make clear that, unharnessed denitrification is clearly a waste of resources. It would be much better not to waste those resources and use them and have them circular back in agriculture. But are there conditions then when actually as an energy carrier, this is part of the process we're doing, and it's not waste because what we've got back out of it is electricity? And I think that's where we need to take that conversation next.
Yeah. Can you comment on that, Mike, or is that...
Yeah, I fully agree that normally denitrification, especially if you have to use external carbon sources to perform this process, it's a waste of energy. It's contributing to CO2 and nitrous oxide emissions, so you should avoid it if possible. And if there are ways that you can concentrate ammonia and use it as an energy carrier, yes, they are. That is much more preferable. But in some of these systems, that's very difficult to retrofit. So then, and you had a specific question, Mark, wasn't it? Could you repeat it?
Yeah.
Please,
So the specific question was about, let's say, the challenges of how precise you have to be in your wastewater treatment plant using Anamox. If you're having half oxygen supply, does that mean that you've got increased technical requirements to operate such a plant more effectively? And are there risks there?
It depends how you want to do it. There are two ways to implement the Anamox system. One is as a side stream for concentrated ammonia wastes, and they are very feasible and used in industrial and municipal wastewater systems all over the world without too much technical challenges at the moment. However, if you want to implement it in an existing system, yes, then it is technically challenging, especially to get the right condition, just enough oxygen, not too much, but also certainly not too little. And that is still a challenge that needs to be addressed. Yeah. And topic of many research groups in the world.
Yeah. There's an interesting question in the meantime addressed at Sarah, which says, as chemists, we are used to be focused on our very specific topic, making it difficult to see the bigger picture, which you are showing, in fact. How could we, as chemists, integrate a systemic approach in our work? Should it be done from the start or later on?
I've just done something terribly wrong and lost a place. I meant to put a link
but you should go to the answers.
I know. I have said I would answer, and then I'm going to have to say it out loud in the chat, and I will copy it over to the question and answer in a little while. I have put a link to an EUPAC project that's happening right now. It's been running for the last couple of years with a group of chemists trying to say, how on earth do we do exactly this? How do we integrate a systems perspective into our education, into the ways that we promote not just education at the university level as we create brand new chemists, but as we develop professionally through careers as well. So I mean, I think it's been quite extraordinary to realize how, compared to things like biology, where there's very clear kind of systems biology and everybody talks about it, and systems engineering and everybody talks about that, there's not so much of a chemical systems conversation out there. And yet chemists are present in all of these conversations. I mean, I'm a chemist originally by training, even though a bit lapsed now. And many chemists work in this context of global environmental change and moving outside of disciplines, working at the interface, like Mark was describing too, at the interface between science and policy, or between increasingly science and business and policy, because many of our global agreements require a stronger commitment from private sector actors to line up and take on their responsibility for these unsustainability challenges that we face right now. So to answer Marie-Helene's question bluntly, yes, if at all possible, we should bring in a system perspective at the start, but very few projects can actually do that. I think we have experience too in what social scientists would call a reflexive mode of working, or what innovation scientists would also describe as kind of, well, all kinds of things really, kind of double loop learning, or piloting and testing, but actually taking the time to recognize that we might need adaptive modes of working. Now, obviously, that's a very, very big challenge for the chemical industry, because you can't adaptively build a huge production plant or a synthesis plant. But I think this also comes back to Europe's commitment to sustainable chemistry, and particularly in the context of circular economy, we are definitely going to have to be thinking about repurposing. And any thought about purpose and activity, I would regard as signaling that we need to be systemsy about it. That's part of what I really wanted to emphasize today as well, that recognizing the interconnectivities and the interdependencies of multiple purposes is often a first step to saying, all right, what systems approach fits this particular systemic challenge? And I think we also know about systemic risks as well, increasingly, that every action that we take will have consequences and equal and opposite reactions somewhere, even if we don't necessarily see them. The last bit is, should we reach out for help from teams like ours? I'd go, yes and no. I mean, I think like many people, we're very overcommitted and under-resourced for these huge sustainability challenges. And it's been very normal that environmental scientists get called in when a problem is already acute, rather than being involved. I mean, this is particularly a problem with chemical pollution, that we only see it when it's way, way, way downstream already. So I think that it definitely requires us to be rethinking the platforms that we speak in, like UNEA, and the relationships that we have between science and business and policy, and of course, everyday citizens as well.
Yeah,
great question.
That is a clear answer, I think. By the way, I mean, there's also a field within chemistry that is called systems chemistry, but that is, of course, very much focusing on more like complex networks and overlooking that as a whole. And that does not involve societal stakeholders like the system science that you are advocating. But I think if I look at education at our own university, at other universities, this is an aspect that we could make our students much more aware of than we are currently doing, and that would already be helpful. That this awareness is bigger than it currently is, I think, with most of the chemistry students or chemistry students in the natural sciences in general. Yeah, Mike, I saw your hands briefly, or was that something else? Yeah, maybe
it's my no, sorry,
yeah.
I was trying to read the chat.
Yeah. Maybe we should go to the poll that I think is now closed. Marton, could you show the results? Yeah. So I think for the ones that were like listed, nickel is a close winner with helium as a good runner-up. But there are also quite some suggestions for other elements. I'm not sure. I think the 23% of others is a very mixed set of elements where not really one stands out. I see potassium, silver, gold, helium, uranium, nickel again, gold, platinum, copper, sulfur is there. Hydrogen, boron, silicon even. Yeah, so that is quite a mix. But I think this is something that that the task group can work with, and we'll think of, we'll look at the different elements and see where we, where the, well, not the next one, but the next workshop next year most likely will be about. Well, I think there are no further questions. There are also no particular things that I would like to bring in additionally. I think I would just like to add from my side that I thought it was a really inspiring day. Mark, yeah, you were...
Yeah, I've not finished yet. I want to ask a question to Bill, because I got you online, Bill.
Okay.
And I think my question is about this emerging ammonia economy, which you're telling us about, which sounds really exciting. Mm-hmm. And I could imagine that taking off and being a great energy store, as you've said, but also potentially bringing down prices. I mean, it's not competitive now, but imagine upscaling on the next decades. And with shipping even more nitrogen around, I wonder whether that could ultimately make nitrogen cheaper. And so I'll go to the other end of the equation. I love nitrogen as an energy store, but I don't like wasting it, don't like air pollution, water pollution, etc. Do you see that there are particular risks of that big upscaling leading to concerns of more nitrogen pollution? And what do you think could be the let's say, the tricks to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Right, okay, there's a lot of things in there actually, I mean, I think certainly, I mean, when I showed this virtuous circle actually, that if you're using, for example, fuel cells, and you can use direct ammonia, so say fuel cells, and there are no NOxes that come from that actually, so that you can, there are technologies that eliminate that. Actually, if people are interested, if you just Google Ammonia Energy Association, you know, there's basically news every week about what's happening. There's an awful lot happening in maritime at the moment. There are 97 different projects actually going on in maritime across the world, and you know, the big engines manufacturers like MAN Energy Systems and Varsica moving forward. So there's a lot that's actually happening. I mean, certainly when I wrote the Royal Society report, I guess you probably know David Fowler quite well actually, and he was on the panel and always keeping me in check actually, that if we have a technology where we cannot, you know, we cannot sort out, for example, ammonia leakage or slippage, or that NOx has become a too difficult a thing to manage, then you know, that can't go forward. We cannot add, particularly if we're going to try and eventually get you know, ammonia manufacturing or synthesis up by an order of magnitude. There can be no leakage. I mean, and we were talking, I said, you know, he was saying, we're talking about a few parts per billion here. And so, you know, we're very aware of that challenge. And that, I mean, I guess one of the things that I didn't say as well, actually, is that, you know, it is actually a route to a low disruption economy, so that with maritime, it's actually retrofitting existing two-stroke engines. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunities, but we do need to manage, you know, the emissions, and any form of NOx, you know, we have to remove. It's similar to what Vudu was saying as well. Actually, we've been you know, looking at managing NOx emissions, essentially using space technologies. We have to go through all these steps, and we have to make it you know, we have to make it safe. And we have to make sure that you know, we don't contribute to any increased nitrogen in the you know, or nitrogen in its various forms in the atmosphere. What's also, I mean, I was very excited about coming today because I wanted to find out more about you guys actually, because you know, we're partners moving forward here actually, and you've got so much that we need to learn from if this is actually going to be something that moves forward, and particularly, you know, with the way in which it impacts on the atmosphere and you know, and elsewhere in the oceans and things like that. So I mean, I hope that the conversation will continue actually, so that you know, we can learn from you, and that yeah, I think that's probably, you know, I guess what I want to say there actually, that there's a lot for us to learn. There's a lot that we have in common. It's a system of systems, Sarah.
Yeah. Rune.
I'm already doodling that, thank you.
just a comment from my side, Mark. The experience from the fertilizer industry, as I said, is that the fertilizer price have to double, and with the prospect of minimum tripling before a new plant is being built. If the fertilizer societies wants to build 2 or 3 ammonia plants more or less at the same time, it will be an immediate increase in engineering cost and equipment cost that will also increase the price of the plant immediately by 30%. irrespective. And to start with, these plants will be between 50 and 100% more expensive to build compared to the standard plants due to risk, etc. So in the period where we are going, if blue and green ammonia really takes off, the price of ammonia will not be low. And the ability to pay for the ammonia is totally different from the shipping industry or from driving a car compared to a farmer.
Does this mean that let's imagine that Bill's vision is going to take off? Does this mean that your expectation is that because of the increased willingness to pay of what could become an even dominating market as an energy store would lead to fertilizer prices increasing in the next 10 years substantially?
Yes. It's very important. If you just take a calculation of the effect of a CO2 tax, capital cost, the variable cost, etc., you will see that you need to double the price to triple the price of ammonia before you're able to reduce the effect of the capital and the CO2 taxes and the disadvantages of the technologies. So there is no way that constructing new plants and building new ammonia capacity for a market that is capable of paying, it will increase the cost of ammonia. But then when you have built enough, then it could be lower.
And there's also a question related to the toxicity of ammonia when it is used as an energy carrier on large scale. Would that cause complications?
That's an interesting one, actually, because I think that the first users of ammonia are probably going to be for transportation will be the farmers in the Midwest of the United States, and I mean, I get that all the time. Actually, the evidence, I mean, and you know this as well as I do, in terms of ammonia accidents and its toxicity, it is corrosive. But given the amount of the 100 million or 180 million tons of ammonia that's around, the safety is there already, and that it's interesting that the first folk who are actually really taking it seriously and seeing the opportunity for the future are the maritime, who actually know and have worked with it for a long time. And so I think that the people who will work with it first are the ones who know and understand it, and that's where maritime is. We're talking with aviation, and they're saying exactly that. Oh, it's very dangerous. It's very difficult. So we've been going through all sorts of scenarios in terms of what would happen if a plane crashed actually with ammonia stored in its wings. And so we need to go through all these things, but we need to demonstrate, and we have a big job actually in getting public acceptance of ammonia in a truck or in a train, and that would just take time.
Yeah. An alternative that is of course hydrogen is also a lot about the hydrogen economy. I think hydrogen is more dangerous or more difficult to control than ammonia.
Yeah, but, I mean, I've talked with the people in maritime, actually, someone from DNVGL, actually, and asking. I mean, I was aware of the ammonia infrastructure and the fact that this is tonnage, and I said, so what's the hydrogen infrastructure in terms of maritime? It's there isn't one. And he said, we're not going to put 5,000 tons of liquid hydrogen in the port and just leave it there. I mean, that 30,000 tons of the Chevron facility is sitting at the end of the runway at Los Angeles. And so in some ways, there's a pervading silence, actually, about ammonia, because it's there everywhere. It's in the middle of Los Angeles. But for me, hydrogen is far more dangerous, actually. You're compressing 700 bar hydrogen in a Mirai tank. And just the mechanical energy is a few pounds TNT if it goes off, because you're taking 20% of the energy to compress it. That's mechanical energy, which if it does explode is a very bad accident. So to me, I mean, having worked on hydrogen, tried to store it, there's so much momentum in the hydrogen economy, and I saw it all in the 2000s, and I can't see it really going anywhere. So it's an interesting one.
Sarah, there's also another question in the chat, but I think you're working on an answer, but maybe you could mention the answer.
Yes, I've just written very quickly. I think there's something really vitally important at the moment about the fact that in the absence of kind of planetary nitrogen authority, we actually do already have many strong links for the governance of nitrogen, for society to steer itself around the nitrogen problem. And so my answer was just, the question was, oh great, so if this is just about innovation and technology and business kind of saving up its pocket money until it's got enough money to invest, what do we do now when the impacts are already accruing? Well, I think what's interesting for me is that business is already very, very aware of the need to, and certainly talking a very hot talk about zero carbon on climate action and about maybe even net positive on biodiversity loss. Now, obviously, there is a bit of hot air in some of that talk. And again, this is why it is important that we do quantify, because quantifying lets us poke the monster when it needs poking. But nitrogen features in both the implementation aspects of the Climate Convention and of the Biodiversity Convention. And so in a way that provides a kind of a little bit of indirect lever. I mean, it's like trying to pick up the problem with chopsticks rather than actually just getting hands-on. But I think the more we're aware of the ways that these policies are woven together in networks themselves, the more that we can sort of make sure that there's multiple layers of coverage, including safeguards to protect people and ecosystems, not just in the local place where the direct emissions, direct environmental losses are happening, but actually really recognizing, I mean, I'm picking up on Volter's comment, picking up about life cycles and the full supply chain. Those have consequences that are happening far, far away. And it isn't, yes, businesses might be not paying attention to natural capital, but they do respond to being accused of, well, eventually some of them do, to the kind of the immediate impacts that they may be causing to communities and societies. So again, this is a separate issue for scientific responsibility to raise the visibility of some of these issues. I didn't write all that down.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another question that has to do with ammonia, not toxicity, but obviously the very strong smell that it has. Would that be an obstacle for more widespread use as an energy carrier?
Well, it wouldn't be for me actually, because I lost my sense of taste and smell from COVID actually. But again, it's almost impossible to answer that one actually. And there's so much of it to do with public acceptance, and in a way, you know, we have to go and ask the farmers in the Midwest actually that question in a way, and just you know, see what their experience has been. I mean, I can't really answer that question in a way.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? It's Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got another question. In our preparatory meeting, Bill, David showed a Royal Society report. In your report, Bill, was a lovely picture of a pilot plant at Rutherford Appleton, I think, where it was indicating going all the way from wind to small scale production. And one could imagine that nitrogen in the future isn't necessarily produced in a big fertilizer plant that's going to need incredible investment, as Rune has explained, but could be going in the direction of small scale local production. So I guess the question is, how far are we away from the technologies that would actually be required to operate that economically, and what's the main steps that have got to be done to get there?
Right, so actually I'm the chief scientist in that program actually at the Rutherford lab, so I know it well. And actually the biggest challenge is intermittency, and you know, it's if you Haber-Bosc and you know, in particular at the moment, you know, when you know you need to keep things at pressure, you need to keep things you know, hot, and so that's our biggest challenge when you go small. We have catalysts that are performing at lower temperatures and pressures, and that's at you know, technical readiness level 2 and 3 at the moment. So you know, we're at the beginning of that story, and it's a research exercise at the moment. We're expanding the facility. We want to, you know, we've got 3 megawatts of PV sitting on top of our buildings down at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, and that's going to be the next level that we go up to. And I guess we're going to learn more about the challenges once we get to that level, Mark, actually. But going small, actually, and being intermittent, you know, don't go well together. But I'm an optimist. I think that we'll get around that one. And you know, there are projects that we're looking at elsewhere in the UK once we get to the next level where you're isolated on an island up in Scotland, for example.
So I get the impression that Mark is satisfied with this.
Yeah, I'm very satisfied. It's very exciting and a great group of people you've brought together. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, so if there are no further questions or things brought up, then I would indeed like to close this panel discussion. I thought the entire day was very inspiring, and I learned a lot about many aspects of nitrogen that I wasn't aware of. So, and I hope that that is also true for the entire audience. So thank you very much. Thank you all the speakers. This was really nice. And with that, I would like to give the floor back to the chair of the day, to Alessandra Quadrelli, who will then formally close the webinar. So Alessandra, that is up to you.
Thank you, Floris. Thank you, everyone. This afternoon was very interesting too, and very inspiring, and open to the future and recent success. I would like to share with you just some elements of conclusions. If you can confirm that you see the slide correctly. This is, you know what it is, it's the periodic table, but the question has been raised about some of the labels. So I just wanted to remind you and reread with you some of the labels. So it's the EuChemS scarcity table. It's at least the name that was given in 2019. And with our revision that added this highlighted in blue, is it sustainable question, maybe its new name should become scarcity and sustainability table, since the two of them are not necessarily the same. But the label that was chosen back in 2019 remained completely pertinent. Is it from conflict resource? Is it used in a smartphone? And by the way, yes, I don't know if you see it, but I just added this white little tag here because we mentioned nylons as one of the plastic present in phone. Green for plentiful supply, or yellow if it's a future risk of supply. But we see that this orange and red labels that originally mentioned only scarcity are actually completely applicable also for sustainability. Rising threat from increased use or serious threat in the next 100 years is not only about do we have enough, it's also about we might have enough, but it might not be sustainable. And I think this is exactly what nitrogen is showing us today. Thanks, Rooney, for showing the precise stoichiometry of the nitrogen to ammonia with the current steam reforming. And I would like to tie back to what Nicola has mentioned, that since fossil fuels are so central in powering most of our chemical-based industry, maybe this black color of carbon should trickle down on all the periodic table. In reality, there is a more restrictive way to see it. And it's really not only about the power that it gives, but really the elements. And nitrogen has this unique capacity, we'll see in some other cases, but it's quite special. We only have one source. It's airborne nitrogen. I know we have seen Anamox. It's a niche still example, but in general we only use nitrogen, and mostly we only reduce it to one product, NH3. So we can say, I think, in this cycle of nitrogen that pertains to the chemical industry, that all the hydrogen is fossil. Therefore, the trickling of the black is not only because it's powered by fossil fuel, but it's because it's really chemically fossil fuel. We've also seen that 10% of this 200 million tons of ammonia go to explosive, and this could therefore justify this, further justify this black labeling of nitrogen. And then we've seen that if 90% go to fertilizers and urea, there's only 5 to 15 that go to ingested food, and others are actually non-ingested and are at the roots of important waste like NO2, eutrophisation, and these blue numbers here are these 5 to 15 compounded by 90%. So we see that even if we think about ammonia to food, it actually only touches from 4 to 14% of this nitrogen that has been converted. All the rest is either explosive or non-ingested food. So we're starting to see a little bit bigger the magnitude of the nitrogen cycle that is being powered and enabled by the Haber-Bosc process that is discussed here. And to recall this planetary boundaries, there is indeed a stern reminder that we have to look at this very closely. So the question could have been, is it orange? So rising threat from increased use? Is it red? Serious threat in the next 100 years? But maybe we can even ask ourselves, the problem is now. It's not in a near future, it's not in a very near future, the problem is already now. So maybe what is really missing from this table is maybe a new title, maybe some explanation on scarcity and sustainability, but also the responsibility that we're not just paying attention to our reflexive behavior in what we could do in the future, but also what we are already doing to our biosphere and to our system. And we should take maybe a step further and explicitly say that there is an ongoing serious damage linked to this nitrogen cycle, and that the chemical industry has probably an important role to play there, both in saying it and in suggesting solution. And we've seen so many of them, and that is very exciting. So again, as scientists, I think our goal is not to break the thermometer, but to bring this thermometer, to read the temperature, and then try to find solution to bring it down. And I'm very curious about seeing where this reflexive analysis throughout the periodic table is leading us. And I'm very happy already that we have a chance to do what we've already done. So I would really like to thank, obviously, Floris and Ninetta as the president and the general secretary of the EuChemS, Nicole and all the members of the periodic table group on the reflection that are being brought up. And I already mentioned David Cole Hamilton, Martin Kottenmeier and Anna Robinson of the EuChemS that help us get this all smoothing, all the speakers, and for the very interesting and insightful presentation, the people who asked questions and attended. And I really thank you, and I hope we will continue this conversation, and we will keep you posted. So thank you very much for being here. We remain at your disposition to continue, and we will be in touch for the next element and for what has been decided on nitrogen. Floris, if I may, I say bye-bye then.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.